Emlyn Fox. I'm editor of PhocusWire, and I'm delighted to be joined by Jeremy Sampson, and he's CEO of the Travel Foundation. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thanks, Linda. It's great to be here.
And just want to start by getting you to set the scene for us.
Mhm.
There's so much discussion about climate change, about sustainability, about how we, do have less impact on the destinations that we deliver, or perhaps bring benefits, more benefit to the destinations that we visit. So, how would you say the discussion has evolved in the past couple of years?
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's evolved quite a bit, and then somehow not enough. The conversation has matured. I'll say that. 15 years ago, I think we were still debating whether or not tourism had an impact, or I think there wasn't sort of largely a agreement about what needed to be measured, and what sustainability even was, or what it looked like. And today, I think most of the industry agrees that tourism has an impact. It's not always great, but the the way that we talk about it has matured, but the action, I think, hasn't really kept pace with that dialogue. So we've moved everyone sort of down the line, and I think that discussion has been really important. But in some ways, I think that consensus has also created maybe a false sense of progress too. In some ways, because while the discussion has evolved, the system itself hasn't really changed at the rate it needs to. And
Mhm.
now, the challenges that the industry is facing, from the climate crisis, and other sort of world events and that sort of thing, are increasing, and the direct impact that has on the industry are also increasing. And so, one thing I like to say lately is that, especially around climate, is that the future seems to be collapsing into the present. So what we expected to happen in 10, 15 years, 20 years down the line in terms of impact is already occurring. And so something I think in the past, people were able to push the ball down the road a little bit and perhaps think that's future me's problem. Now, are sort of having to grapple with a present that maybe is more challenging than they had expected. And at the end of the day, what hasn't changed at all are really the systems and the structural incentives. So most of the industry is still rewarded for volume and not value. Most of the industry is still focused on short term gain, and there's still a huge amount of fragmentation and um, uh, silo challenges that exist across the sector, which is many sectors sort of morphed into one in some sense. So I think there's been progress of people trying to work together and think about these issues, but the structural incentives in the system are still very difficult to overcome. If we're going to get to the rate of change that I think is needed, given the severity of some of the challenges that we're facing.
And I think we'll dig into some of those systems and structures and incentives a little later in the conversation. But one thing I did want to pick up on was kind of the data evolution, because now it seems like more than ever we have the data to our hand. We can see, the science-based evidence. The industry is able to measure like never before. So, two questions there: what are the gaps still, and actually, does the industry know what to do with the data now that it's got it?
Yeah, I think that probably is the gap. It's true that we have more data than ever, which isn't necessarily a good thing. I think that in some sense, quality over quantity might be the name of the game there. But if you think about it, we've moved from sort of self-reported sustainability surveys that were primarily in Excel spreadsheets to huge amounts of data that are revealing and revealing structural exposure and risk for companies, whether or not they even want to engage in that process. And businesses are reporting on risks and destinations, and not necessarily sharing that data either. So there is quite a lot of data out there, and I think the shift from sort of voluntary disclosure to third party third-party data has mirrored what's happened in other sectors, like financial services, for example. But the biggest remaining gap, I think, is connecting the dot with the data. So people having the capacity and sort of, I think, knowledge about what to do with that information, and certainly, the connectivity points between different parts of the system where data isn't necessarily aligned or shared. So if we need collaboration and collective action in order to achieve, sort of common goals or address common challenges, but we're not using, there isn't the same data available or the same, we're not looking at the same indicators across different sectors, and it's going to be very hard to then come to a, common decision making process or make understand whether or not we're actually making progress and measuring it in the same way. I think that's the big gap still, and there needs to be some intermediary support. Travel perhaps doing some of that work already
Yeah.
with the data hub that they are developing, which we're
Yeah.
really supportive of.
Yeah. Would just a quick follow up there. You talked about some organizations perhaps not sharing. Is there a feeling there they're not sharing because the data they're getting back is not positive?
That's definitely a thing. That's definitely a thing that exists within travel and tourism. I think there can be a fear sometimes of talking about challenging things. The Travel Foundation, we love to bring together people and create dialogue about some of these challenges, because we think it's important to understand how things are changing and to be proactive about making the right choices ahead of those changes if possible, to build some resilience. We've been working quite a lot on risk in the last couple of years, and what we find is that, the response, and the sharing is primarily done from a compliance perspective and not necessarily from a solutions perspective. So
Right. Look at me, how good I am with my
yeah,
certificate, whatever
exactly. And
program,
sustainability
whatever.
professionals are, especially in large corporations, are now in a situation where they do have quite a lot of reporting that's needed. So they spend a lot of time trying to meet the necessary compliance requirements, but not necessarily thinking about, like, how do we use this information? How do we make decisions with this data that can actually help us make change?
Mhm.
And how does this affect, our place in the sector? How do we share with others? How do we share even across functions within companies? So I think that kind of data still isn't being used enough in commercial decision making, and it feels quite fragmented from between the sort of sustainability ESG teams and those that are sort of driving the commercial and marketing decisions in companies.
And of course, AI is related to the data conversation. Is it helping to expose some of the data? Is it helping to make it better to join those dots to get better measurement and therefore, encouraging better dialogue and perhaps action?
Yeah, you know what? I think that we're still trying to understand that in some ways. But I see a huge potential for something really important with AI, which is, there's a huge amount of money, resource, time, energy that's put on data and trying to measure. Let's just take even something basic like climate action, which requires actually companies to start by measuring their emissions. And it's a hugely complex process that has locked some companies into massive amounts of resources, actually, just to create a baseline and understand their own contribution to global carbon emissions. But with AI, we're able to, I think, very quickly get extract data that will help companies to make to have as close as really needed of an estimate, or very very close to understanding exactly where those emissions sources are coming from. in a way that actually could reduce the resource and time and energy that's put on the, having a expensive consultant do that measurement or trying to figure out this big puzzle. It was using available data, using proxies in order to understand everything that you need to understand about where the highest sources of emissions are coming from, and then putting that time and energy into actually doing something about it. That would
Hmm.
make a huge difference. And I think across the board in tourism, there's so much effort put into planning and strategy and that sort of thing, and not nearly enough put into like actually figuring out the solutions and what there is to be done about some of the big challenges that we're facing. So I'd love to see that AI, AI could also make a big difference in creating a sense of um, where there may be available solutions that are that in places that are already working. If we can create some shared intelligence
Hmm.
around these things, and people don't want to reinvent the wheel. So I think that's another opportunity, but just be able to get through some of that stuff quickly and moving on to the action would be a big difference maker, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So, we talked about data there. We talked about potential for AI to improve that. The signals that we're getting, that the better measurement that we're getting, does that then feed into the certifications, the initiatives, the programs, and improve them? Are they also evolving? Because there always seem to be so many of them, and nobody really knew what most of them did or were about.
Yeah, I hope that they will evolve, because I think the biggest gap really from a certification perspective has been an understanding of whether or not these certifications and these reporting schemes are actually creating better outcomes.
Yeah.
In most cases, the certification programs and in the early days of the sustainability movement, this was really important, that those created um, this created some alignment around what good practice looks like, where some of the red lines were. That the industry had used to have some really poor practices that have been eliminated for the most part. Creating just a sense of a shared definition around around what good practices look like, and what needs to be measured and managed on a consistent basis. But the challenge in stopping there is that you don't really know whether or not someone is actually making progress or not. The reward or the incentive is for actually just doing the work of putting in the system. And so I think I think at the end of the day, the other problem maybe is that the certification programs around sustainability and related issues are somewhat disconnected from the day-to-day business of travel and tourism, which is to design and sell trips. For the most part, everything is pointing towards selling travel and getting people to spend money as part of their travel journey. And then the sustainability work and sustainability data and all this stuff has really largely existed in a bit of a silo from that work, and isn't in any way sort of connecting the dots to create a business case. What I like, and where we see the bridge potentially making that more useful, is the concept of risk, because risk starts to get at the business case of why they're, what does the future look like? Where is the business of travel and tourism potentially, at risk of not being able to continue to grow or thrive? And what does that mean for the decisions that we need to make around you uh, demand generation, investment in the supply chain, and making sure that this is done with a layer of sustainability and of equity in order to create more fairness.
So that's interesting. The risk side is because I want to talk about, this kind of shift from, voluntary programs and certifications to mandatory, and whether, we are now seeing with the EU green transition, some of these things creeping in. And in fact, the team at Travelist says that that could actually be the kind of global impetus to call out greenwashing far more, far more often. And actually, is that what we're going to see? Is it going to be regulation? Are governments going to mandate some of these things? Is that going to be how we enforce change?
I think so.
Yeah.
I used to say maybe 10 years ago, I would have said that travel and tourism is the largest unregulated sector in the world. And I would already no longer say that because regulation is coming, and first and foremost, it's already coming through sort of tourism adjacent regulation. So
Yeah.
already there's regulation related to climate, related to climate change. There's regulation related to, um, infrastructure. There's regulation related to workforce and housing and all these things that sort of touch tourism
Yeah.
in really
Yeah.
important ways. Yeah. But I think, and I think the next frontier is really that destinations and, are going to have to, regulate and going to have to take a little bit of control, over, over the tourism sector's impact and footprint on places. And this is happening whether the industry is ready or not. And so I think that companies that are treating it just as a compliance burden rather than, a structural signal are not going to be well positioned. But
Mm.
there are smarter moves that are happening though, that, those who are engaging and trying to get a seat at the table so that, that they can be part of creating smart regulation. I think people do get that that's still possible. And I think that's what everyone wants at the end of the day, is to have, is to be able to create these discussions. So I think it's a really good thing, actually. I think it can, help to bring about change that has been difficult in other ways. I think the risks really are, especially for larger operators, is the inconsistency of regulation across different jurisdictions. This is already creating a whole massive confusion. And for small operators, the compliance costs are already pretty disproportionately burdensome,
Yeah.
compared to those big companies. So I am concerned a little bit about the sort of equity, where does sort of the equity and fairness sit in that context? But
Yeah.
hopefully there will be some semblance of alignment around some of those things as time goes on. It's interesting too. There are some places, the Canary Islands is an example, great example actually, where they have gone to operators just recently, and they've launched a regenerative tourism fund for projects in the islands that are helping to support communities and support the growth and evolution of the tourism sector towards a more regenerative approach. And their pitch to operators for participating in this fund has basically been, regulation is coming and you're going to
Hmm.
have to pay regardless. So why don't
Hmm.
why don't we create opportunities to make this a positive signal rather now, and do that proactively rather than waiting to be taxed or what have you, and not have as much say, or not have sort of a positive narrative that we can talk about once that arrives. And I think that's a really smart pitch, and people are buying it. There's a lot of people that have engaged in that program already.
That, and that, it sort of has echoes of, I think Japan has talked about restricting people or the amount of people coming. And I think, obviously there was the Venice model as well. I was reading that they had kind of doubled the amount of days that the levy would apply and doubled the cost from €5 to €10. And still more people came, although they did see a slight dip last year. So my question would be, where do those schemes kind of fall down? Is it just not enough money? Do people not know about it? What is it that would make something like that succeed?
Yeah. I think that what makes them work, and what makes them potentially a useful mechanism is as much transparency as possible. And that hasn't always been a thing. So in places where there's a levy, but it's the way that money is going to, where that money is going to go, who's responsible for it, how it's going to be allocated, and how it's going to help the tourism sector actually to address some of its challenges. I mean, there's so much potential for that to be a really strong, solid narrative that
Mhm.
that government, the government agencies can shape, and all too often it's left without that narrative, and either it's just not transparent enough on the front end, and so all of a sudden, hoteliers are blindsided by a levy that they weren't expecting that's going to be then passed through them or passed through the DMO, or on the back end in terms of where where the money is actually going to go, and how that's going to benefit the place. I mean, I think in general, there's just been a lack of real solid investment, enough money and budget allocation for the supply side of tourism. If we're going to tell a great sustainability story about the sector and all these certification programs and the OTAs and travel list and doing all this work to try to help, create better decision making possibilities on at the purchase point. We need to be able to back it up, and we need to be able to tell, to have a supply chain and to have destinations that reflect the reality of that narrative. And I think there's a huge upside to these levies being able to create that, to create that investment that oftentimes is lacking. And I think that operators and destinations will get it, and will understand that need, if that story is told really well.
I think it was you who famously said at the PhocusWire conference, or perhaps infamously, at the conference a few years ago, if the OTAs were to just take a tiny portion of their marketing spend and invest it in a climate action fund, then, we'd all be a lot better off. Do you very much see the burden should be on the travel companies themselves, or should it be consumers who we know have this massive say-do gap? Because, our own research has showed that up enough times. Who takes the burden? Who carries the burden?
Yeah. I think it should be a shared burden. I think it's a false binary to say it has to be necessarily one or the other, but I do know that it's hard to ask travelers to make really good decisions when we haven't presented them with, enough meaningful choice. I stand by my statement, from a couple of years ago, and especially when you think about the size of budgets that that some of these
The
companies are
billions.
talking about. Yeah, we're not talking about. I never said, "Oh, stop marketing," or let's.
No, you just said take a tiny piece of that and give it to the climate action
Yeah,
fund.
yeah. It's an argument that I feel it's hard to push back on, but we still don't see quite the level of investment. Where my thinking has evolved, though, and where I think there's a huge opportunity for the sector, I think that the money that needs to flow into places is most likely going to be a sort of a blended finance model, that will come from the industry putting some skin in the game, absolutely, from government, unlocking, at the policy level, the same skin in the game that they often are also not. Most of that money is still allocated to promotion, even at the sort of state, national, DMO level.
Yeah.
And what's
Yeah.
interesting there is that the tourism sector is always turned to ask to help in moments of crisis for recovery and that sort of thing. And all this money that goes to recovery goes into marketing. But the industry will be hard pressed to continue to play that role, if infrastructure is not up to snuff, for the adaptation and resilience that needs to be built as visitor flows are shifting, as seasons are shifting. If we're not able to sort of match the needs on the ground, I think it's going to be very hard for the sector to deliver on that promise. On the flip side, with proper investment, I think the other piece is from banks, being able to bring in low interest loans and that sort of thing, which have been long considered risky. But with the industry putting skin in the game and a potentially intermediary to blend some of that finance in a way that can de-risk those loans, it's quite possible that climate finance and those sorts of things could be much more accessible to the sector over time. And we've seen some signs from industry that they are willing and interested to to support something like this. There just isn't the mechanism to make all that happen now.
I'm interested to know what happens to the discussion and the signals and the interest in polycrisis, because we are now all the time subject to so much disruption, economic, geopolitical conflict, climate change, obviously. What happens to these discussions in these times?
Well, people get exhausted, first of all. I mean, and I think that's personally and professionally, it's just there's only so much that one can deal with. And I think what happens, unfortunately, is that some of these issues get siloed or, put in a sort of box over here. But there's a couple interesting things that are happening now. I think number one is the sense that maybe what we're talking about here is not sustainability or regenerative tourism for climate, not all these buzzwords, but really just things are changing and being
Yeah.
able to put some numbers to that. Like I was saying earlier, I think there's a stronger business case than ever to explain things are changing. We need to be ahead of the change. It's some of the changes is actually good for some places. I mean, there are opportunities within crisis too. But it is clear that things are not going to be the same. And I think that the cost of inaction is probably the biggest risk of all. And so I do think there's an increasing understanding of that. The other thing that I think has been super interesting, if you observe the last couple of years in the US, with the Trump administration's sort of anti-climate position and people really watching to see, well, what would happen? Are people going to, is climate change, climate action going to go away? The truth of the matter is that it hasn't gone away, but it has become a lot quieter. And in some cases, it's been tucked into other things. So are people using buzzwords in the same way that they were a few years ago? Absolutely not, because that's too risky. But I work with a couple of state DMOs actually who've just started calling all of their sustainability climate programs economic resilience, because it's really hard to argue with economic resilience. It's something everyone can kind of get behind. And there, without those sort of signals that are politically challenging, there you have in a quieter way the work continuing. And I think there are lots of examples of this that actually make it so that so that these crises can actually be bound up into a narrative, a common narrative that I think will be helpful, because I think some of those political challenges are unhelpful in tackling these issues, because everyone's so worried about the signals on the surface and not what's going on beneath the surface.
I just have a kind of final question for you. What does success look like to you
Mm,
when it comes to climate change, sustainability, and travel?
yeah. Um, I've changed my tune a bit on this in recent years. We at the Travel Foundation have really started in the last 2 years or so to focus much more on adaptation and resilience. I believe that the industry will decarbonize. Will it be fast enough? And how do we get there faster? These are hard questions, but ultimately, there are a couple big areas that we know are the barrier. Are the barriers. We know that getting aviation to shift is a really hard task right now. We're still only at 1% of the necessary amount of sustainable aviation fuel that's needed, and it's a hard it's going to be a long haul.
Yeah, it's
I
a big
think,
mountain to climb, that one.
yeah,
Yeah.
long haul. I guess pun intended on that one. But so I think things are, the industry is going to decarbonize, and we hope it will happen as quickly as possible. We advocate for that. On the other hand, we also know that regardless of that, economics play out in the way that they will, and it's already becoming much more expensive to travel. The price of fuel, even before the current crisis, was getting higher, and the sector was having to sort of account for the cost of carbon, and I think these things are are playing out and they will continue to play out. At the same time, the industry needs to adapt. It's critical actually that the industry understands the change and can be as adaptive and resilient as possible because the world needs travel and tourism, and it needs travel and tourism done well. I think
Mm.
to be an important part of the global economy. So that's what I think success looked like. Actually, is that travel and tourism has taken it, has become a sector that truly and finally demonstrates that it is, a key part of the global economy in a positive way. That we, that we're able to see through, economically resilient places that are being driven by travel and tourism. That is low resource intensive. That is bringing, fair benefits to places, and that actually is helping, is helping economies to make a shift. That I think, I think is what success looks like to me, and that communities are not going to suffer because there wasn't enough proactive thinking or understanding of, the very real risks that places are facing. So yeah, that's kind of a long answer.
No, but
And I
that
think,
seems like a great place to end, on a really positive note. So, Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us. Really enjoyed the conversation.
yeah, me too, Linda. Thanks.